Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo.
You know what I find interesting these days is the way the unity develops across denominational lines, and not so much in terms of the strict denominational differences that we've known in the past. To put it very concretely, if you or I are in a room with the right member of another denomination, say you and I speaking, and out of a more liberal tradition with a certain social justice orientation and so on, I may find that I have greater kinship of spirit and a greater sense of unity around those kind of questions with you than I would have with a very conservative Catholic theologian.
Joining Father Bacik in this discussion is Dr. Glenn Hossman, Director of Toledo Campus Ministry. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of the ecumenical movement today. Here's Father Bacik.
Glenn, you and I are now colleagues in a sense at the Interfaith Center at the University of Toledo, and representing different Christian traditions and trying to work together on various projects. And therefore I thought we would be suited to talk about the topic of the ecumenical movement today in the church, in the churches, and the whole drive towards Christian unity. So I presume that you're open to that kind of conversation.
Yes, Jim, it's good to be with you.
Good. And let me begin by saying a bit of an overview here of how I see the movement currently, and then we can pick up on various aspects of it, okay?
Fine.
You know, I'm interested, of course, in it from a theological viewpoint. And as a matter of fact, over the last 15 years or so, there's this tremendous progress in the theological level. We've had these bilateral conferences where theologians of various Christian groups have gotten together and hammered out the tough, divisive issues in relationship to ministry, to the Eucharist, to our understanding of baptism, and our understanding of authority and leadership in the church. And I suppose the remarkable thing about these conversations that have been taking place over many years and with fine scholars and so on is the remarkable unity that has been achieved. In many cases, we'll get common documents produced by the theologians, Catholics and Lutherans, Catholics and Anglicans, Catholics dialoguing with Methodists, and so on. And on the stickiest questions, the things that have divided Christians for 400 years and more since the Reformation in the 16th century, we find that by dialogue, by openness, by refining our positions, that we achieve a virtual unity on all of these matters. The recent Anglican dialogue with Roman Catholics, which went over a 10-year period and so on, I think has produced virtual unity on the major outstanding questions as one example of all of this. So I suppose that's one thing that we could look at in relationship to the whole ecumenical movement. Why don't we stay with that one for a while before we move to institutional and grassroots questions?
Fine, Jim. These examples that you've given are in the area of what we call faith and order, and these discussions, these dialogues have been going on. As you point out, the most recent ones have been between the American Lutheran Church in America, where they have hammered out some very significant steps toward unity, and then the Anglicans and Roman Catholics have progressed significantly toward unity on the Eucharist, understanding of the Eucharist, and then probably most recently have been the Anglicans and Lutheran development, where they are now sharing in the Eucharist.
Yes, and these are really tremendous gains of the kind of things that people perhaps thought were impossible really at one time in history. You know what I find interesting these days is the way the unity develops across denominational lines, and not so much in terms of the strict denominational differences that we've known in the past. To put it very concretely, if you or I are in a room with the right member of another denomination, say you and I speaking, and out of a more liberal tradition with a certain social justice orientation and so on, I may find that I have greater kinship of spirit and a greater sense of unity around those kind of questions with you than I would have with a very conservative Catholic theologian. That might be shocking for some people to hear, but that is the fact. That's the situation that we have. And it's not just at the theological level that happens, but at the other levels as well and other outlooks where that kinship really cuts across the denominational lines. It seems to be based more on whether people are open to a contemporary viewpoint of the world, whether they think of the Christian message as very concerned with social justice questions or not. That kind of liberal-conservative division seems to be the greater division that we find today right within our churches.
My own perspective on that, Jim, would be that probably up until the early 1960s, we had some significant development in the discussions around faith and order, and then they tapered off because we began to get in some very tight and nitty-gritty kinds of discussions that couldn't, at that point, seem to be resolved. But in 1960, as you well know, the movement in this country towards civil rights and justice questions, and then the whole peace movement developed. This pulled Roman Catholics and Protestants back into dialogue one with the other, and many times on the fighting line, on the front lines of the civil rights struggle and the peace movement effort, as they hammered out their social justice kinds of questions together and confronted the principalities and powers, if you will. Often Roman Catholics and Protestants came back into dialogue on the tough questions of faith and order, and then today, as we see through the 1970s and the early 1980s, we're making some significant headway in terms of resolving these questions.
And I think that what has happened is a certain level of trust has been built up over the years. As people interact on many questions and deal with concrete issues, you learn to trust one another. So if you and I work together on a peace question and we find a kinship on that, then it's easier for us to talk about where we might differ on matters of faith or on church structure. When you use the phrase order, faith and order, I take it order refers to the structures, the institutional side of the relationships and so on.
Absolutely, the way the church governs itself, in the particular denomination, and those kinds of structural questions relative to a denominational posture toward bishops, for example, toward the laity, get into the order questions of how a denomination actually lives out its existence.
And as we come closer together on this level of trust and so on, I think we're able to put the hard questions to other people. In other words, I think at a theological level, we had this euphoric beginning where we would sit down and talk to one another. I can remember doing that in the 60s and sitting around with Protestant ministers and talking about how we prepared our sermons and getting together for an ecumenical service for the first time and just visiting one another's churches and so on, engaging in some living room dialogues, as we called it in those days, Catholics and Protestants gathering together. And that was really an exciting period. It was adventuresome because we were finding out new things about one another, and so often there was so many similarities. Oh, do you read that scripture passage on this Sunday? Well, so do we. You know, and do you believe this? Well, so do we. And it really was exciting. But I think what happened theologically is that first period of learning the similarities and so on passed. We assimilated that. We got used to it. And what I perceive now is that we're willing to ask each other the hard questions. Maybe not totally, but we are doing that for one another. I know at some high levels there have been theologians who have posed that to the Orthodox theologians and saying, well, in the early creeds, when we talked about God saving man, we were talking about mankind, and man in the church really meant all the humans in the church, and therefore do the Orthodox really have to be so opposed to the ordination of women, which they are. In other words, the Protestant side, who are ordaining women, are posing that kind of hard question to the Orthodox now in this ecumenical movement. And the Catholics and the Anglicans did this to one another. In other words, putting the question to the Anglicans, what really do you think about the Pope, the Bishop of Rome? How could you relate to the Bishop of Rome? And I noticed the Archbishop of Canterbury recently was posing that question publicly. How much uniformity would you and Rome demand if we did come together? How much autonomy would you give us? How much could we retain our own tradition? So that kind of really difficult question, I think, is now being asked. So we're at a new stage, I think, where the deepest buried kinds of differences are now raised to the surface and are in our consciousness, and we are dealing with them. And I think very often when they get raised, we have found successful answers to them, again, at the theological level. We're talking about people who are in the know here. And so
if I had my guess, I would say that in the future we'll find the questions around order, that is, the church structure, will become more paramount in our discussions rather than faith, because many of the faith questions now have been resolved, more difficult ones around the actual Godhead, for example, the figure of Christ. These kinds of things have now fairly well been resolved. We're getting down now to power questions around order, around prerogative and autonomy, and those sorts of questions.
They're probably harder to deal with. Let's just stay with the faith questions for a minute, again, at the theological level. I think that, the historical disputes that we saw at the time of the Reformation were around the solas, as we say in Latin, the faith alone, the works, the playing down of works as the whole means of salvation, Scripture alone, that kind of outlook, those fights seem to be overcome. So at one time we had Catholics saying, well, Scripture and tradition. And we had Protestant theologians saying, no, Scripture alone. All the truth of God is in the Scripture alone. And after fighting over that 400 years, I think we have found out that, a formula for solving it, that God is the spokesman. He's the font of revelation. God speaks a word to us, and that it is mediated to us through the life of the church and as it's enshrined in the Scriptures. In other words, we find a formulation, a way of saying that, instead of fighting about it, that we can gather around. And I think today, those historical fights about Scripture alone and faith alone and grace alone that the Reformation raised, we have found ways at the theological level of overcoming them. They're not difficulties anymore. And as you suggest, then that takes us to the order question and the government question.
Well, I think also the faith questions, as they have become resolved one by one, and as we have found unanimity and have felt comfortable with one another in our trust relationships, now the difficulties begin to seem to surface around applying those faith questions and how they're interpreted to some of the major social and political concerns, economic concerns of our time. And it's interesting to see the refinement that comes in theology as they are applied to the daily nitty-gritty questions of living out the faith in the world.
No, historically, a lot of, I think, overcoming of the differences occurred in crisis situations during the Second World War, for example. I think in Holland, for example, Protestants and Catholics came very close together in terms of the resistance or dealing with the Nazi question and so on. That when you are in crisis or under fire, somehow those faith differences or the historic differences don't make so much of a difference anymore. In other words, we're united around fighting a common foe. People who were in prison camps together didn't much worry about what their historical traditions were. They were ready to band together in whatever way they could. So I think when we meet the difficult situations, it seems like there's just more important considerations to keep in mind than the differences that have plagued us over all these years.
Particularly if they're centered around human questions such as hunger, for example, or questions such as adequate health care. Very quickly, those very basic kinds of human concerns pull us together in concerted action and concerted effort toward the resolution of those major human questions of our time.
I think that's a good point, and a good one for us to keep in mind. When you talk about the order again, that's where a lot of our difficulties are going to come, and it's going to become around the question of the role of the Bishop of Rome in all of this and how one achieves some sort of unity around that. I think it's interesting that when Pope John the 23rd was Pope, there were many leaders in the Protestant world who said, when he speaks for me. And I think that there's a way in which various groups are recognizing the need for a focal point of unity in the Christian world. I think it's obvious that as we confront the great social questions, if we could have a unified front, we would do better. If we fight the questions of war, nuclear problems in our world, if we could really come together and get all the Christian people with a major spokesman shouting out the message of peace, we would make a much greater impact on our world. And so I find that many in the Protestant world, and you'll have to check me on this, are beginning to sense the need for some sort of unifying person or force within the whole Christian world.
Well, I think there's certainly a feeling of collaboration and one of supportiveness in the fellowship that goes on. I remember very recently, and you will too, the action of the American Conference of Catholic Bishops relative to nuclear arms. And then in the next day's press, the United Methodist Council of Bishops supported those bishops in their posture in opposition to the arms race.
Yes, a powerful witness, an example of collaboration again. I think that there's probably a lot of emotional feeling yet connected with this focal point of unity and figuring out what role Peter plays in this, the successors of Peter and so on. The Catholics and the Anglicans, of course, have come very close together on this, where Anglicans are ready to look at the need for a unifying figure. And I think the statement was made, well, if you're looking around historically for a person to play that role, you probably can't find any better position than the Bishop of Rome. That is the person who would have to play that kind of role. Then it becomes a question of, well, how much diversity would the Bishop of Rome countenance in this federated church? And I think a lot of theologians think that that's the direction in which we have to move, sort of a federated idea here where people would carry into the unified church their own traditions and be able to keep those and celebrate them and find a lot of their sense of belonging around their traditional approach to Christianity. After all, we start out as a theological premise. There's more than one way to live out the essential message of Jesus Christ. Right within the Scriptures themselves, we see diverse responses to Jesus of Nazareth. And so that sort of is the theological basis for the pluralism that we have today.
I tend to agree with you, Jim, and I think our thinking is very parallel in many of its, as we live it out together. I think where we're going to hit some problems along the way, we talked pretty much about theologians and bishops and popes and this sort of thing. I think where I see the difficulty coming in the future is communicating this apparent unity that we feel at the very highest echelons of our denominations, our churches, down to the grassroots level where the people in the pew still haven't caught that vision quite as readily. And in some cases they've caught it more so. In the general feeling, though, that I get is that there is a kind of a renewed denominationalism, a renewed parochialism that is going on today. And we're going to have to address that at some point to get a widespread grassroots feel for this movement toward unity that we're talking about.
Well, that's an important aspect to discuss. Let's stay with that for a while. And I think that historically, in the United States, much of the difference denominationally that governed life in Europe has simply not been the case. In the United States, people have often worked together and played together, and we've had so many interfaith marriages in the United States that I think a lot of those traditional differences are broken down. If you look in the United States, I think people aren't aware of the real tensions that existed in relationship to the denominational differences between Catholics and Protestants. That just hasn't been so much a part of our heritage. We have a bit of the melting pot at work, I think. So at one level, it seems like we're ripe for an ecumenical movement, or that it's almost a natural thing for many Christians today, I think, to say, well, yeah, we could worship together, and no, I don't think those Catholics are all that bad, and no, I don't think those Protestants are not going to be saved or something. In other words, there seems to be in the American psyche a certain openness or tolerance for this. But I suppose what you say, I find that interesting, as sort of a rise of new denominationalism. That's what you're suggesting, huh? That's interesting to explore. I'm not sure I perceive it that way. I would say it this way, that all the way along the line, people's own parish has been important to them, and that's been their way they've lived out their Christian faith. So if we have a Mass for us Catholics on a given day, say Thanksgiving Day, and a common service in the evening, we're going to have more people at that Mass. That's their natural way of worshiping God and giving thanks. They're comfortable there. They're at home. It would be harder for them to drive a little ways and get to another church or go into an unfamiliar setting for that common service. It seems to be a natural gravity in the parish.
I guess what I'm sensing is that my own personal background is United Methodism, and I sense in my own denomination, which is one of the largest Protestant denominations in the country, concern about overall membership. And there seems to be a drive in this denomination, at least, to shore up the troops, to find out why we have had a slight loss in membership overall. And I sense this in some of the other major Protestant denominations, the concern over members, loss of membership, and these are basically the more liberal, the more mainline denominations, I guess you would say. And probably this is the pressure that was caused in the last 5 years from the more radical evangelistic wing of Protestantism in this country, a pressure that's come from heightened memberships through television ministries, etc., for these smaller groups. And this pressure on the mainline denominations has caused them to look internally and to have a great concern about shoring up their own denominational membership.
And that would then sort of reduce this drive for an ecumenical unity.
I would sense that'd be true, yes.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And I think you raised the question of the more evangelical groups that we consider to be sort of outside the mainstream Protestant groups. I guess from our viewpoint, the Catholic side, we've always found the mainline churches to be more interested in ecumenical matters, more interested in sharing in common worship services and so on. And I guess where we find a bit of interest among the evangelicals, that's we sort of rejoice with that and are hopeful that continues to grow. But I would say, would you not agree that generally the mainline churches have been more interested in doing things ecumenically?
I would say at their highest level this has been true. When it's lived out in many of the local denominational churches and local churches and parishes, it becomes more difficult sometimes for them to bridge those gaps. Sometimes it becomes easier, but often I observe that it becomes more difficult. And that's, I think that's the way we are ordered, that the way we are structured. It's often around membership, it's around the dollar questions in our economy. And that kind of pressure on these local parishes many times is the overriding factor that says yea or nay to whether they will cooperate with other churches, other denominations or not, in local ecumenical events anyway.
I guess there would be some sense that we've run out of gas a bit at the grassroots level on the ecumenical movement. As I suggested in the 60s, we used to have those living room dialogues where Protestants and Catholics would get together and we had a book that we read together and discussed it, and those were exciting times. And many Catholics, I think, were visiting Protestant churches and vice versa and praying together. And again, it had that sense of exhilaration. I don't see a lot of that happening anymore. I think that it's probably happening in more anonymous ways or implicit ways, just working together on projects and so on and taking for granted that we have this fundamental unity. But almost everyone would say, I think, that, well, the ecumenical movement, maybe, if not dead, has lost a lot of its momentum at the grassroots level. Maybe we have to do things to try to rekindle that in some way.
I think that's absolutely true. I wouldn't want to be too pessimistic because I see evidence in smaller groups of a great deal of activity, study groups, pastors getting together to read significant works and study together and to share experiences, laity getting together in prayer groups and in home Bible studies. That's very exciting, and that is happening here locally, and I would want to affirm that. I sense an overall tenor of kind of drawback and waiting and seeing really what the denominations are going to do, because at the highest levels there is some there's changeover and there's transition occurring, and I think there is some confusion at the local level as to which direction do we go now. Kind of wait and see. And probably in the next 5 to 10 years we're going to see some movement again that's going to be very exciting at the local level.
I think this whole week of prayer for Christian unity is an important thing, and we ought to be pushing that in some ways in our churches from January 18th to 25th, isn't it? That traditionally we've had this week of prayer for Christian unity. I know you and I are going to do some things together on campus. We're going to have a lunchtime service, invite others, and here in our West Toledo cluster of churches, we're going to meet on the 23rd of January to have an ecumenical service. And I think around the city of Toledo and surrounding areas there, we will find these services during this week or near that week going on, as well as some pulpit exchanges, which are sort of exciting. We're going to do that with some people at our place.
That's absolutely correct. And in the city itself, there are going to be many activities actually beginning here in Toledo on January 16, the anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. Celebration that Sunday afternoon at St. Paul Baptist Church beginning at 3:30 And any clergy in the city that want to participate in that service can come and robe at 3 o'clock in the narthex of the church. Following day, the Christian educators across the city are going to meet at Monroe Street United Methodist Church at 10:30 in the morning to discuss ecumenical work they can do together in Christian education. And then the various pulpit exchanges and laity exchanges that will be occurring for several Sundays around those significant dates. It's an exciting time for us in the ecumenical movement here in Toledo.
Yeah, and I think that whether or not the timing of these events, what seems important is the sense that things are going on that way, that the movement is still alive, and that people are called upon to participate in it in their own way. And I think that augurs well for the future then, if we can build a little momentum again and people don't just have the sense that the movement really is dead. I think we haven't talked a lot about the levels of the top leadership. Many of us would feel that that's where more is needed. A lot of us would like to prod the top leadership and say, let's do more. We'd like to see maybe our national grouping of bishops do more reaching out to other groupings and more common activity and so on encouraged. And I think the theologians generally feel that, well, we've done the work, it's there, it's sitting on their desk. Now we would like to see some activity on their part and implementation of the agreements that we've already reached. And of course, as you and I know and want to stress, that real action is at the grassroots level. That's where the church is real, in the local congregation. Certainly we want to fight prejudice there and gain a more open-minded attitude so we can indeed move towards Christian unity.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo.